on. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Chris Preston, who until his retirement was based at the Biological Records Center, where he worked on compilation, analysis, and publication of plant records, something with which quite a few people in this room might be a tiny bit familiar. Not me, I'm really bad at it. He has authored loads and loads of publications, including co-authoring BSBI's second plant distribution atlas, the new Atlas of the British and Irish Flora, published in 2002, the BSBI Handbook on Pond Weeds, which I think have got to be the best plants to collect because you get to go swimming at the same time. And most recently, he and David Pearman have been working with Clive Stace on the hybrid flora of the British Isles. Chris's talk today is titled, How Natural Are Our Alien Species? Over to you, Chris, and I'll give you the little clicker thing.
Right, well, it's certainly a great pleasure to speak here in front of real people, and to hear that buzz of conversation again. But as I'll explain, ironically, my talk is actually a byproduct of the COVID lockdown. We're told that we are a storytelling species, and we certainly like to tell stories about our alien plants. Alien species are those introduced intentionally or unintentionally into our area by human beings. And we read in a journal no less than Nature that the English elm is a clone brought by the Romans from Italy via Spain to support the vines in their vineyards. Flora Britannica tells us that the naturalized autumn crocuses, which were abundant in meadows around Nottingham for many centuries, were brought to the area by the Benedictine monks of Lenton Priory from their headquarters at Cluny in Burgundy, whereas the same species growing in Lancashire was imported by the Knights of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem as they returned from the Crusades. Our distinguished new president, who it's a delight to see here, has suggested that Mackay's Heath in Western Ireland owes its presence to the unintentional introduction of traders between northern Spain and the west of Ireland, perhaps even smugglers operating illicitly. And rather drearier species, hoary crest, Lepidium draba, is said to have arrived from mainland Europe with hay stuffing mattresses, which were supporting fever-stricken soldiers returning from a particularly disastrous defeat of a British expeditionary force in 1809. And Shetlanders will tell you that the Magellan ragwort, conspicuous species, was brought to their archipelago by local whalers returning from the Antarctic. Well, I'm not going to discuss today whether these romantic stories are true or false or unproven. My interest in them is that they reveal what I think is the normal attitude to alien species. We think of them as wild plants that have arrived here with us by some means or other and become established here. And if we were so minded, we could take a trip to their homeland and see them growing as natives in their original places. And that was certainly more or less my view of alien species until COVID. But today I'd like to develop another perspective, which is one I began to think about recently. And like I expect many of you, as Sandy's mentioned, we were faced suddenly with lockdown and needed a project to keep ourselves occupied. And my obvious project would have been to declutter a very cluttered house, but that didn't seem very satisfactory or appetizing, really. So instead, I turned to some work I've been doing with David Pearman for many years, because when we were planning the new atlas in the 1990s, we decided to put in information about the first records of alien species in the wild, and also for cultivated plants, the first time they were cultivated. And in the limited time we had available while doing lots of other things, David compiled a data set, which we published in the new atlas, but we'd always intended to work this up and publish it in detail with details of the sources. And so this is what I found I could do. I was actually locked up in the house, and I wasn't one of Sandy's people out in the garden botanizing. And I went systematically through the 1900 or so alien species in Stace's new flora, or at least the neophytes. And as I did this, I realized that many of them weren't actually other people's native species at all, but they were plants that weren't really native anywhere. They'd been modified in various ways, intentionally or unintentionally, by human action. And this is what I want to elaborate on in this talk. And I've divided the plants into 7 categories, though these are rather arbitrary and overlapping categories with many links between them. This is my first category, which is a bit of a transitional one. I've called it atypical selections. They're alien species which are only represented here by species which do occur elsewhere as natives, but either a restricted proportion of the overall variation or very atypical samples of those species. And this is a recently arrived species, panicle willow herb, Epiplobium brachycarpum. I haven't seen it myself, and as you see, it's rather a twiggy thing, and I think it's probably impossible to photograph amongst other vegetation, which is why Ken's photo is against this grey background. It arrived as a single plant on a gravel drive, or at least it was first seen as a single plant on a gravel drive in Colchester in 2004. And it's lucky it arrived in Essex, because Ken is very thorough and has written up the story in characteristic detail. The gravel came from somewhere called Stanway, and the epilobium turned out to be well established there. And by 2010, there were millions of plants, Ken says, growing on the old gravel ground. It's North American species, very widespread from sea level to altitudes of 3,000 meters or so in Western North America, and it's morphologically very variable. So there are lowland races with large flowers, like the upper one here, the stigma protruding from the flowers well above the anthers, and these are outcrossing. And then there are highland races with smaller flowers, the stigmas club-shaped rather than divided at the same level of the antlers, self-pollinating. So these characteristics, which we think of in Britain as distinguishing different species, this one rather like the Epilobium hirsutum, great willow herb, and this like American willow herb, Epilobium ciliatum, are found on the same species in this variable plant. And the plant we have is one of these small flowered self-pollinating strains. And the same is the case in Germany, where the species has become established locally in some abundance. And in Germany, molecular work has shown that these come from upland, or no, morphologically, they clearly come from upland strains. And it may well be that we have the plants established because both their climate tolerance and their self-pollination favors their spread. This is my next example of a very restricted variant, the Babunda buttercup, native of the Cape provinces of South Africa, now a notorious weed of Mediterranean climates worldwide. Well established here in the Channel Islands and the Isles of Scilly, but not as far as I know in mainland Britain or Ireland. And it's perhaps a bit surprising it hasn't spread in recent years in response to milder winters. Now in South Africa, this is a heterostylous species. There are 3 different sorts of flowers with long, medium, and short styles. And as with the primrose, which has pin and thrum, you only get seed if you cross plants of different morphologies. There are also 2 common ploidy levels in South Africa. There are diploids and tetraploids, and very rarely there are pentaploids with 5 sets of chromosomes. But the common invasive plant throughout the Mediterranean and in our area is a sterile pentaploid with short styles, doesn't produce any seed, but it reproduces clonally by underground bulbils. So it's a form you're very unlikely to find if you look in South Africa. But it is clear why an introduced plant like this with such a biology will be able to spread more rapidly than a plant that's reliant on seed set between different morphologies. Group 2 are what I've called evolving on the journey. These are species which may have set out from their homeland as typical representatives of the species, but have evolved and are now something different in the place they're established in the wild. And my first example, this narrow-leaved ragwort, Senecio ignaquidens, had just about become established in southeast England when recording for the last plant atlas closed in 1999. But it's now very widespread, as the maps will show in the forthcoming atlas, in lowland areas throughout Britain and Ireland. In Cambridge, in the area, my impression is that it spread from railway lines initially, then onto roadsides. This is also a South African species, but not from the Cape, but from rocky habitats in eastern South Africa and Lesotho. It's a self-compatible perennial species, and it's spread very widely in mainland Europe, and there have been many studies of its spread in Europe, which I'm hoping to summarize in a sentence or two. It was first recorded as many different introductions in the 19th and early 20th centuries, mostly with wool imported from South Africa, but these largely didn't become established, and that was true in all the British sites. It was only a casual. At a few European sites, small populations became established and persisted, but didn't spread or only spread very slowly. But some time in the late 20th century, it began to spread much more widely. And in fact, it turns out that this spread was from just 2 European centers. It spread into Central and Western Europe from Verviers in Belgium and into Southern Europe from Mazamet, a site in southern France. And it's the Belgian population that's relevant to us. It was first recorded there in 1922, and molecular results show that it was a population from a highland part of the native range. So that's like Epilobium brachycarpum. In Africa, the species flowers in the southern hemisphere spring and summer, so October to February. And at first, it continued to flower at the same months, sort of September to December or January, in Europe, even though, of course, that's our autumn and winter, not our spring and summer. But gradually, the time of first flowering shifted forwards from 1922 until it was beginning to flower at the beginning of May. And obviously, that's going to be much more successful, especially as the seedlings are intolerant of very cold winter temperatures. And so I think you can see this changing flowering time as possibly a visible symptom of probably a much more wide-ranging adaptation to the European climate that was going on in the Belgian population. And then eventually it spread out from Belgium along railways and major roads. It engulfed some of the other smaller populations, like one of Bremen, which had been established for some time, and spread westwards. It engulfed the population in Calais, and I assume it was this population that spread into Britain in the late 1990s, though as far as I know, there's been no molecular study of the British plants. A second case which might come in this category is one of the alien species everyone loves to hate, the rhododendron. This is a remarkable rhododendron wood near Killarney, which we were taken to on a Biological Society meeting by Rory Hodd. And molecular evidence indicates that there are 2 areas for rhododendron in the world for the native ponticum, one in Spain and Portugal and one around the Black Sea. And it's clear that our plants come from the Iberian Peninsula population. But they became hybridized and introgressed with other more cold-tolerant North American species after they were introduced, presumably in the nurseries and specialist collections in which rhododendrons were grown in Victorian Britain. But there's no agreement about how to treat this complex situation taxonomically. In fact, there's considerable disagreement as whether you continue to call our plants Rhododendron ponticum, even though they've changed, or whether you call them a hybrid Rhododendron super ponticum. And during my COVID reading, I was astonished at the sort of strength of feeling and the vehemence of language, the publications about this rather arcane matter of plant nomenclature. But whatever you choose to call it, it's clear that the rhododendron we have isn't the same as the rhododendron you would see if you went to the Iberian Peninsula. And whether its modification is actually the reason for its great vigor is another point of dispute. This is a very long-winded category. It's a simple category, but with a long name. These are garden plants that a huge number of our alien species, over half the neophytes, are garden escapes. And this is a category for those that have been modified in horticulture before they escaped and are present still in the wild as species, but in their ancestral forms rather than the forms we see them for. So they've been changed for characteristics, some of them obvious, like more flowers or double flowers, flowers of different colors, etc. Others doubtless less obvious, like germination requirements. And this is the first time I thought seriously about this, was when, with Arthur Chater and Geoffrey Halliday, I tried to work out which of the two European subspecies of dotted loosestrife, Lysimachia punctata, we have in Britain. And it was clear that the plant we had didn't match either of them, really. It was a gaudy, much more floriferous plant than either of those. Lilac is one of my examples in this category. The illustration on the left is the first published illustration of lilac. An important point exemplified by lilac is that many of our garden plants weren't brought to Europe from the wild, but actually came from gardens in other cultures, like the gardens of the Ottoman Empire or the empires of China or Japan. And so we can assume that very probably they'd undergone selection even before they got to Europe. Lilac is one of these. It came from the gardens of Istanbul in the 16th century. You can see, Mattioli has illustrated rather a wilting plant at first, and it's a bit of a construct, because although you've got very realistic flowers and fruits, they're growing at the same time on the same plant. And a few years later, he obviously got a better specimen to illustrate and illustrated that. But you can see how thin the inflorescences are here and here compared to the very sort of floriferously dense modern plant. And this is not a very extreme example, because obviously you get ones with double flowers, you get funny colors and that sort of thing. And one quirk of the lilac story is that it wasn't known to Europeans in the wild until about 200 years after it was introduced as a cultivated plant, and it wasn't until John Sibthorpe of Oxford was exploring in Turkey in 1794 that he actually found wild populations. And a third of these modified plants, this is from China, orange daylily. It's rather surprisingly long been cultivated there for food and for medicine as well as for ornament. And the plant in cultivation is a triploid, although in China you get diploids as well as triploids in the wild. It reached Britain by the late 16th century, and since its arrival in the West, and probably before, it's been the subject of an intense breeding program. Thousands of cultivars are known, and in fact it's rather widely recorded now as a garden throwout. And as so often, at least to my eye, I think that the plant breeders have produced are considerably uglier than the ones they started with in the first place. This category 4 are the garden plants arising in cultivation as species or hybrids and are not known anywhere in the wild. This again is a large category, but it's much more easy to identify them than the species in the last category, where it's often difficult to know whether species have been modified or not. And some of them, their origins are lost in the midst of time. And this includes the familiar marigold. It's been known in English gardens since medieval times. Gerard, in his Herbal, already knew divers sorts of marigolds. And if you're sharp-eyed, you can see he illustrates 6. This is number 6, the single marigold. There are multiple double and big ones as well. And this is a polyploid species. It's unknown in the wild, and all we can assume is that it came from somewhere in Western and Central Mediterranean, where the genus had its center of diversity and was derived by hybridization from ancestral species. And a similar plant is the hollyhock, which is so widely recorded as an urban escape these days. This is said to come from Eastern Asia, but nobody's very convincing about where it comes from. We don't really know. And again, this was known to Gerard, and Gerard actually says, sown in gardens almost everywhere and in vain sought for elsewhere. So even Gerard realized that it wasn't to be found as a native plant in the wild. And this is my third example of an ancient garden species, nasturtium, probably of hybrid origin, very widely grown in South America in pre-Columbian times, and reaching Europe as seed imported from Peru to Leiden in 1684. And of course, it's since been developed further by hybridization. The more recent garden hybrids are sometimes more precisely documented, but not as frequently as you might think. But this is Montbretia, a hybrid between two South African species, but it wasn't created until they reached France, when it was synthesized in 1879, and it reached Britain almost immediately afterwards in the horticulture trade. It was first recorded in the wild here in 1907 as a single plant, but it's now obviously abundantly naturalized, particularly in the West, and has spread into moist, temperate, and upland tropical climates worldwide. There are innumerable other examples. I've just got two. There's the hedge hebe, a fully fertile hybrid between New Zealand parents, widely naturalized on sea cliffs, first reported to readers of the Gardener's Chronicle in 1859, and the readers were invited to enter a ballot so that they could obtain this exciting new hybrid. Other hybridizations quickly followed, so there are lots of cultivars, but it wasn't until the 1940s that it was named in San Francisco, which is why it gets this rather inappropriate name, Franciscana. And my final example is a 20th century example, the Russell lupin, developed by George Russell, a rather sort of cantankerous Yorkshireman on his allotment. He was a perfectionist. He developed his lupins year after year. They became something of a tourist attraction, but he wouldn't give anyone any seed until he did a rather canny deal with a commercial nursery in 1935. And the Russell lupin is now the most commonly recorded lupin in the wild in Britain, though not in Ireland. Right, well, we'll move on to category 5, crop plants selected from living progenitors. Now, this is the exact equivalent for crop plants of the lilac group for garden plants. These are crop plants where the same species still occurs in the wild as the original progenitor. In the case of crop plants, the crop often has a different name, so these are rather easier to recognize because the modified garden plants rarely do, and they've also been the subject of a great deal more study. And there are many examples from the legume family, the Fabaceae, in this category, and mine is lucerne or alfalfa. This is Medicago sativa subspecies sativa, cultivated with purple flowers, not known in the wild, but it's a tetraploid derived from a Western Asian subspecies, Cerulean, a diploid. And it probably arose several thousand years ago, Southwest Asia. It was greatly prized as fodder for horses, and it spread into Europe by classical times and also eastwards. It had reached China between 100 and 400 AD. There's archaeological evidence for its presence there. We didn't start growing it in Britain until the 17th century, but by the early 18th century, it had been recorded in the wild. And it probably doesn't differ very much from the wild subspecies, and for that reason, it becomes very well established in the wild and hybridizes with the native subspecies falcata, which is much rarer. Here's another example of the opium poppy, another plant probably derived from a wild subspecies Satigerum, and now cultivated for its seeds. as an ornamental and obviously in more lawless parts of the world for other products as well. There's no doubt that it's very frequent escape, as here by the ooze washers, but the books all tell you that the native form, subspecies Atypical, occurs as a rare casual as well. Now, David and I have been trying to find a valid record of this, and all the specimens we've looked at are hispid versions of subspecies Somniferum. We can't find a single genuine subspecies Atypical from Britain. So if anyone knows of a genuine record of that subspecies, it would be very interested to hear about it. This shows that there is really no very strict dividing line between garden plants and crops. And my final example in this category is another one, grown both as a crop and as a garden plant, the familiar sunflower. Before I started this work, I used to imagine sunflowers growing wild in the prairies of North America. I had a very vivid mental picture of this, which was complete fantasy, because when I started reading about it, I was told and learned that these sunflowers, which have the wonderful name of monocephalic sunflowers, a single head on a big stalk, are known only in cultivation. And they were selected in North America some 5,000 years ago from a much-branched, many-flowered ancestor, which still occurs on the prairies. But you can only find this in gardens or as a garden escape, and obviously rather widely in Britain as a casual, but rarely more than that. Right, these are crop plants. This is category 6. This is equivalent to the garden category of crops which are not known anywhere as wild progenitors in the wild, which belong to the same species or hybrids. And whereas most of the garden examples are hybrids, most of the crops seem to be treated taxonomically as species in their own right. And of course, it's a bit arbitrary whether you name a taxon as a hybrid or as a species of hybrid origin. But I think the crops reflects the fact that they're often highly fertile, whereas the garden hybrids are often very sterile. And like many crops, they've lost many of the features that allow them to persist in the wild, so they're often only recorded as casuals. And I think everyone will be familiar with the fact that many of our early crops come from Southwest Asia. And my example here, the broad bean, is a species of completely unknown origin. People imagine it must have been derived from an ancestor which is now extinct, but we really don't know. There are also many other crops like this, flax and linseed, linum derived from Linum bienni, and the barleys and the wheats, which have had their story exhaustively researched. Central and South America is another major source of crops, which was less emphasized if you went to the sort of schools I went to. And this is our solanum, which I wasn't going to get away without putting in a solanum. This one is the familiar tomato, which certainly did very well, at least vegetatively, on the streets of Cambridge in this warm summer. And this has a complex history of domestication in Central and South America. But it's curious that nobody seems to know actually how it arrived in Europe. It was definitely in the 16th century, but who brought it and where it landed, we don't know. Quinoa or quinoa, Chenopodium quinoa, is another of these South American crops, domesticated for over 7,000 years in South America, was a major crop in the Inca period, but the Europeans took little interest in it really until recently when it became a fashionable food, and it's also planted for game birds and for wild birds. There are rather fewer crops from North America, but the spectacularly misnamed Jerusalem artichoke is one of them. This is a hexaploid, which molecular studies have revealed is a hybrid between a wild diploid and a wild tetraploid, but it is unknown in the wild in North America. But it's certainly able to compete with wild vegetation in Europe, and it's become something of an invasive species in Central and Eastern Europe. Although the native European porcupine has apparently taken a liking to it, eats the seeds and the tubers, and probably disperses it and spreads it into new localities. And this sort of molecular work is one of the really impressive developments, I think, in the study of our alien species in the last 2 decades. And another, which is perhaps less obvious and came as a surprise to me in my COVID reading, was the high quality of recent archaeological work in China. There's an exceptional amount of really good stuff coming out of China, which has done an enormous amount to increase our understanding of plants associated with human settlements in Eastern Asia in the last few thousand years. And both these sources of information, the molecular and the archaeological, have come together to illuminate the story of the common millet. Although in this case, as we'll see, the molecular work has not so much solved the problem as given us a problem we didn't know we had. Millet is one of the world's most ancient crops. It goes back to the same time as wheat and rice in the very start of cultivation. But it's got a very short life cycle, and it's ideal for semi-arid, warm environments. It was grown in the Neolithic in China by 5000 BC, spread westwards. It reached Central Asia and Europe by the Bronze Age. And it's an allotetraploid, so it has 2 species in its ancestry, each represented by a single genome in the plant. And one of these genomes hasn't been identified, but it's shared with another old world allotetraploid, a perennial Panicum repens, which is very widespread perennial weed. And we don't know where this genome comes from, but it's presumably some old world millet that hasn't yet been identified or doesn't survive. But it's the other genome that has been identified that's the enigma, because that's the genome of Panicum capillare, which is a widespread North American species of Panicum, but as far as we know, a completely new world species. So how on earth did the genome of a new world species get into a crop which was developed in Eastern Asia in the Neolithic? It's a complete mystery. Right, well, you'll be pleased to learn that we get to the final category now, of which I've called mysterious strangers. And these are the aliens which are naturalized in Britain and Europe, clearly introduced, but we haven't a clue where they come from. And my first example is orange whitebeam, Sorbus crociocarpa. I've chosen, as it was named by one of my botanical mentors, Peter Sell, who studied Sorbus particularly. It's very widely planted as a street tree. It's naturalized in places, as photographed here by Tim Rich, Peter's successor as the Sorbus expert in Anglesey. But we don't know where at all. It presumably comes from somewhere in Europe, but nobody has been able to match it up. And another rather equivalent tree, which many often recommend for small gardens, perhaps many people grow a Juneberry, Amelanchier. This is, in some ways, an equivalent to Sorbus in North America. It's a complex genus with sexual species that hybridize, and there are apomictic species. So its taxonomy is difficult, and there's no consensus in America how it should be treated. But nevertheless, it is rather curious that nobody has ever found in North America anything matching the plant that's grown in Europe, and except you do get in North America plants which have clearly been introduced from Europe in cultivation and have escaped, but nobody's found the wild plant in North America. And the final mysterious stranger is this bindweed, Callistegia pulchra. There's some evidence, not very conclusive from molecular work, that it's a hybrid between the very widespread bindweed we have, a native Callistegia sepium, and an East Asian species, but the details of its origin and its history are quite unclear. So that's it, my gallop through the alien flora, 1900 species in 30 minutes or so. What's the meaning of it all? Well, I was always told about giving lectures that you ought to have take-home messages. Well, I don't believe in take-home messages. I think botany is too complicated to be neatly packaged up and given out as like presents at the end of a children's party. So you won't get take-home messages, but I hope there's a bit of food for thought. And I did think quite hard whether I needed to make my first point to this audience, the concluding remarks, and I decided perhaps I do, because I've lost count of the number of times I've been out with botanists in groups recording, and we've come across an alien species, and one member of the party has made a disparaging remark about it and moved on. And so the first point I'd like to make, which has been repeatedly made by others, such as E.J. Salisbury, who wrote the New Naturalist, Weed and Aliens, and Mick Crawley and Clive Stace in their successor volume on alien plants, that alien species may sometimes be troublesome, they may be invasive, but they're also very interesting scientifically and well worth study, just as native species may be troublesome and invasive, but also interesting and well worth study, even those that aren't particularly rare. I hope I've convinced you that quite a few of our alien plants are not natural at all, in the sense they're not simply other people's natives growing here in an unmodified state. And if I have convinced you, you'll probably ask how many such species they are. Are they a significant proportion of our alien flora, or just a few rather atypical examples? And I wish I could answer this precisely, but I can't. The problem is knowing how many of the garden escapes are modified and comparing them to the wild natives, because there's rather little research in this area. But maybe there are people in the audience who can answer that, but I found I couldn't in looking through. All I can say that it is a very significant proportion of the aliens as a whole. It's at the very least 15% of the neophytes in Stace, but given that over half our aliens are garden escapes, and I suspect quite a large number of those have been modified from their wild progenitors, it might even be 30% or 40 or even 50% of the aliens we record. Given this, I think that frequent references you see to alien plants as an aspect of globalization or biotic homogenization aren't really very accurate. I think what we're observing is something much more profound. For millennia, we've not only been modifying the environment of the planet, but we've been modifying the species too. And so we're increasingly living, I think, in a world of our own making. And thank you very much for listening. And thank you to the people who've helped me put the talk together.
Best person at keeping to time that I have ever seen, which is amazing. So we have about 10 minutes for questions before we start the next set of things. And when you do want to ask a question, can you put your hand up and wait for the microphone to come, because this session, as I said earlier, is being recorded, and all of these talks will be on YouTube, including the question and answer. So it'd be good to get your question and David's answer on the recording. So questions, please.
This is Nick Scott. I'm the partner of your new president, Michelin. And as some of you know, we've been working for the last few years together on the Lusitanian species of the west of Ireland. And it's, you know, as you were giving the talk, I was really pleased to see this recording of first dates when it first came and where it was found. We've been amazed at how useful our information is to archaeologists. We've been going to meet archaeologists to get some idea how things came, you know, and presenting what we know. And they've been saying, this is amazing. We've never ever had proof that this happened. You know, they're just showing a little bit of pottery is the same as a little bit of pottery somewhere else. And plants have the potential, because you can often recall when they first arrived through pollen or whatever, and now with molecular studies say exactly where they came from, to prove a trade route, which they've always suspected and never known. So I just wanted to make that point, that what you're recording now is really useful for other studies. I've been amazed by it.
I think this reminds me of another bit of work we did, which I haven't really dealt with in this talk for the last atlas, which was on archaeophytes and the ancient introductions. And it was terribly striking how there's a world of archaeological literature and there's a world of botanical literature, and they scarcely overlapped. And all the botanists were going back to Godwin in 1975 for their information. And there was a vast amount of archaeological literature, and an archaeobotanical database, and which botanists were just not aware of, and this sort of compartmentalization.
Yeah, the only way we can get access to them is actually go and see archaeologists.
Yes,
they record things in such a different way than us. We're off to see Sir Barry Cunliffe on Monday, just because they tell you all these amazing things, you know, because the way they record them isn't kind of scientific, it's kind of just speculation, you know. Yeah.
Great. Other questions? I think that's hurrah for cross-disciplinarity.
Roger Kemp, my name. In the early years, I was brought up in Bedfordshire, where sainfoin was a very common plant. And I understand recently it may come back as a good crop for nitrogen fixing, I think. So where would you put that in your grouping? And the other one, I had growing in my garden, hairy slender tear, Vicia laxifolia.
Yes, I know the one. Yeah.
Now, I did present that to our Bucks Rare Plants group, and they wouldn't accept it as a sort of rare plant on the understanding it was, I think, an archetype or whatever. What's your view on that one? So, sainfoin and the tear.
Yes, I don't really have views on whether you accept them or not as rare plants. I mean, that's an arbitrary decision for people to make. But the first point, the sainfoin, is a very interesting species because that seems to have been introduced as different genotypes as time has gone on. And the ones you see by roadsides is a great big, tall, erect genotype, which is clearly rather a modern introduction. There are earlier ones which are less agricultural, more prostrate, etc. There's a view that those are native, and people will tell you that there's a bee associated with them in the Salisbury Plain, and they must be native. I don't think they are. I think they're just very ancient introductions of the same species, because I think if you look at Onobrychis, it's a Western Asian species, really, and I think it spread westwards with cultivation in Europe. So I think the Onobrychis illustrates how very complicated the history is of our interactions with plant species. Yeah.
Great.
The tear, is that a recognised?
Is that?
You have to hold the microphone quite
close.
close.
Is the tear I mentioned, how do you describe that? Is that a...
I think that, isn't that thought to be classified as a scarce species? I can't remember. I think that's classified as a native.
We'll have to look it up, and we can discuss that in the lunch break. Jonathan.
If some of these alien species are not found anywhere else, should they actually be regarded as endemic?
No, I think you've misunderstood, Jonathan. They're not found anywhere else as natives. They're found widely in other places as escapes, but they're not. I mean, there are one or two that aren't found. There are the neo-natives, which are both introduced in a sense and endemic, like perhaps Oxford ragwort, and they are very odd species. But no, they are. It's just that you can't find them native. It's not that you can't find them except in Britain. Yeah.
Great. We have time for maybe just a couple more questions. Are there any others? Anybody in the back? No, well, I'm going to ask you a question then, Chris, to kind of let people gather their thoughts. Are there any of these introductions for which you have data recorded that are now no longer here?
Yes, there are.
Small proportion, large proportion?
Well, it's impossible. The trouble is with all this, it's impossible to define the size of the alien flora, because you can take the ones in Stace and you can say there are 1,900 of those and work out percentages from that. But that includes a whole load of other things, including exactly the ones you're talking about, the ones that were previously here but have gone, and they range from things that were fairly well established, as like there's the Poppy ramiria hybrida, which was fairly frequent in chalky fields and has now gone, right through to things that only ever occurred as one plant once. So there are, and the extinct aliens would be another rather good talk, because they reflect fashion, and a lot of the wool aliens, that, including some of the seleniums, were quite frequent in certain specialist areas and have now gone. But they sort of reflect human fashion and trade routes, rather later trade routes than Nick was talking about. But they're all tied in.
So something I've always wondered about, being an alien myself, is how do you?
Not to trouble someone.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So kind. Is how do you distinguish between an archaeophyte and a neophyte?
Well, you'd have to read the paper for that, but there are about 7 criteria, I can't remember, but an awful lot goes on. There's a combination of archaeological records, and people always say, oh, they were introduced in the Neolithic. Well, the truth is they were often introduced in the Bronze Age, when trade became much more wide-ranging, and habitat information, if there isn't a native niche for them, as it were. But we did write quite a long paper on that, which
I'll have to read it. I'll have to read it. Well, thank you very much, Chris, for an absolutely fascinating talk. And I'm sure that people will have lots of questions during various breaks, and you will be here and be happy, I'm sure, to answer all kinds of questions. So thank you very much again.